Here is the story you asked for, told in a first-person voice that feels lived in and intimate, closing on a fully heart-warming resolution. I'm including a powerful opening hook, then a brief 5-chapter breakdown as a compass, and then the complete cinematic script in 5 flowing parts written only in paragraphs. The river under the bridge sounded like someone quietly tearing cloth, long, steady, resigned. I didn't come for heroics. I came because sleep kept its distance and the city had left its lights on. Frost climbed the railings like a pale vine, and my breath drew ghosts that didn't linger. I heard the dog before I saw him. One bark smothered mid-birth, then a whine shaped like apology. He was the color of the bridge's shadow, tucked behind a concrete pillar where the wind pooled, and the ground kept the days cold like a secret. His eyes found mine and held them the way drowning finds a hand. I told myself to keep moving. I told myself it wasn't my business. The wind disagreed, pressing a smell toward me, wet fur, rust, old river, until my excuses felt flimsy in my mouth. He tried to stand, thought better of it, and lowered his head with the careful manners of the hurt. Somewhere above us a truck crossed the bridge, and the whole scene shivered. A dusting of grit fell like tired snow. "Hey," I said the way you talk to a story that might not let you go. "It's okay." The word had no meaning yet. Still, something in him chose to believe it for the length of a heartbeat, and the night changed shape around the tiny decision. Chapter breakdown. The story opens beneath the arch of a winter bridge, where sound is a constant and comfort is not. I find the German shepherd hidden in the geometry of shadow and wind, the concrete radiating a tired cold. He is wary and weightless in the way of hunger. Trust must cross a long distance measured not in steps but in heartbeats. The first exchange of breath, the first offered food that isn't a trick, the first time his eyes decide I am not the same shape as harm. Rescue is not an act but a conversation in a language neither of us speaks well yet. Choices harden into action. A cheap blanket becomes a promise with edges. I learn to be quiet with my hands and loud with my patience, guiding his trembling body from iron and echo toward the car's muffled warmth. The river keeps ripping its cloth. The city pretends it isn't listening. In the rocking space between the bridge and a kitchen light, the dog lets sleep stalk him and fail. Fear is an animal inside an animal we both learn where not to touch. The first bath is more baptism than cleaning, and dinner is a liturgy served by the spoon. Safety is a muscle that must be trained. Mornings are small lessons, the kettle that hisses but never bites, the leash that suggests rather than commands, the way a hallway does not always lead to loss. The world intrudes with its old faces, the rumble of trucks, the sudden clatter of drop pans, and the shepherd recoils into the before. I become a quiet place for his body to lean, and he becomes a mirror for my gentleness, teaching me where my impatience still sleeps. Outside, the bridge remains, a stern teacher awaiting our return. We go to the bridge in daylight, because ghosts dislike being looked at. The road above thrums its indifferent hymn, the pillar still smells like iron and apology. He stalls, shakes, and considers the old nest of fear. I do not pull, I kneel. The scene holds its breath until he takes a step, then another. A man in a city jacket pauses, nods, moves on, as if goodness were a thing you could pass on a sidewalk and not break. Later, the past knocks in a different forms. Someone arrives claiming the dog as lost. The scar on his neck tells a harder story. The only honest witness is the shepherd's own choosing. Paperwork becomes a quiet sacrament. A collar soft enough to forget does not touch the old wound. Life begins again in unremarkable rooms, sunlight pooling on rugs, the smell of boiled chicken, the measured joy of a dog resting his brow against a shin because he can. Trust does not arrive with trumpets, it arrives like morning. Again and again, until you can't remember how the room looked in the dark. In that light, the bridge shrinks to a place on a map we no longer need to unfold. The water under the bridge taught me the math of cold, how it counts you by fingers and doesn't mind if it loses track. I stood a few feet away and let my hands be busy with nothing, adjusting the blanket over my shoulder, steadying my breath, letting the silence between us be large enough to hold both of our doubts. He was a German shepherd, or half of one, the rest stolen by days that bit back. His ears sloped like surrender, his ribs made parentheses the wind read aloud, His right forepaw lifted as if it had once learned that floors sometimes decide to move. I crouched to change my height, turned my shoulder so I wasn't a face advancing, but a shape keeping company. In the places where the bridge's paint had failed, rust made orphaned constellations. I thought about the long argument between suffering and attention, how often it ends in stalemate. "Can I come closer?" I asked, which is not a question dogs answer, but manners matter when the world has forgotten them. His eyes flicked to my hands. His nose drank the air between us like it might be spiked with intent. I set half a protein bar on the concrete and slid it forward with the back of my knuckles, slow as a tide. He watched me the way a fever watches the doorway. The river's breath grew louder. Above us a car crossed and dumped a momentary rain of dust over my jacket. He inched his muzzle toward the bar, took it without looking away from me, chewed in the delicate, guilty way of creatures who have been punished for wanting. The sound was small and absolute. When he swallowed, something loosened in my chest that had been braced since childhood, when we learned that some doors close and stay that way. "Good," I said, and my voice wasn't mine. It belonged to anyone who has ever seen a life decide to continue. I brought the blanket forward like a flag of truce. He flinched at the whisper of fabric, his spine asking everything behind him to disappear. I stopped. The wind moved around us, tried all the keys on its ring, found none that fit. A train horn far off reenacted a sadness it would never understand. On the second try, I let the blanket lie open on the ground between us, a small, warm continent, and drew my hands back to my knees like I was putting my weapons down. He stared at it, stared at me, and then placed a paw on the fringe, as if signing a foolish treaty. The rest of him followed, unsure, the way an apology follows its own echo. When I lifted, there was no struggle, only the alarming lightness of him, the way his bones felt like someone else's mistakes. He didn't bark. He made a sound I won't describe because words cheapen it, and I will not do that to him. I wrapped him and felt the blanket grow wet, where his breath met its weave. We stood, and the whole bridge seemed to rise with us, the river tearing its cloth, the trucks insisting, the concrete pillars bearing witness and refusing, all at once. I talked on the way to the car, the way you talk to sleeping babies or to grief when it thinks it still owns the house. The cold made instruments of my cheeks and nose. My hands learned the old choreography of steadiness. He trembled in the blanket as if a small motor inside him had been turned up too high. In the parking spot under the skeletal limbs of a winter sketch tree, I opened the passenger door and laid him on the seat. He tried to fold himself into the seam between the cushion and the back, as if disappearing were a trick he could still pull off. I turned the heat on low. Not mercy exactly, but its cousin. When the engine vibrated, he flinched like a gunshot had crawled under the skin of the world. I turned it off again and let the night sit with us. The glass fogged. My breath wrote and erased messages I didn't read. A minute passed like a pulse learning a new song. Finally, I tried again, and this time the engine's drone sounded like a homely hymn. He didn't sleep. His eyes made 2 dark coins in the dash's weak light. The road home was a string of small choices to keep going. In my kitchen the light wasn't perfect, which made it right. It was the color of bread crust, soft at the edges, and it held the room together without having to glare about it. I set the blanket on the floor, and he stayed inside it, a decision disguised as an accident. The tap ran warm water into the cheap plastic tub I kept for potted plants and emergencies, and the sound made him look up in panic, so I turned it off and waited for my mistake to learn its lesson. His paws were raw maps. His neck, where a collar had once drawn its mean circle, carried a crescent of healed skin that glowed pale against the dusk of his fur. Hunger had made neat work of his waist. When he turned, I saw the bony question his hips had become. I warmed a little broth, diluted it, placed it near the edge of the blanket, and left the room so he could think without an audience. From the hall I listened as the bowl trembled and then steadied, and the sound of drinking made something ancient in me lie down and rest. He let me lift him into the water, because he did not know how not to. I kept the temperature at the exact degree where relief lives. The first pour over his back made his chest go rigid. The second unlocked a breath that had been lodged, stoned somewhere under his ribs. Dirt left him in ribbons, little rivers crossing his legs and traveling the tub, and the water turned the color of bad news before clearing again. I said his name even though he didn't have one yet, as if somewhere he did, and I could borrow it early. He leaned his head on my knee, and I felt the weight of trust arrive like an inexperienced bird, more bone than feather, promising flight on a different day. I cleaned his ears with a careful cloth, traced the lines on his paws with a finger soft as apology, and avoided the scar at his neck the way you step around someone else's story until you've learned the right door. When the water ran from him, it made opals at the drain. When I lifted him out, he shook, and diamonds broke from the ends of every hair and died on the tile before they could gleam. Night advanced, thinner, but still insistent. I made a bed from towels and an old sweatshirt that knew how to fit around tiredness. He chose the sweatshirt, of course, because worn fabric keeps a record of care. I spooned food into a bowl in small amounts that wouldn't fight with his instincts. He ate like a secret. The radiator clicked and he twitched. A neighbor coughed and he folded his ears so far back it seemed they might vanish.
"You're safe,"
I said. Knowing safety is not a word but a practice. And practices are learned by repetition, not by speech. When I turned off the light, I left the hall lamp on to keep the dark from trying anything clever. In the soft half-glow, he lifted his head and watched the doorway for a while, then lowered it and tried sleep like a shoe he wasn't sure was his. He woke me before dawn, not with noise but with silence, the kind that alters the room. I found him sitting, not quite standing, the way bodies do when they want to be ready for whatever comes. Outside, the sky considered blue. I made tea and he watched the kettle gather its small storm. Steam wrote a vertical river up to the ceiling and disappeared into the stubborn cold. I opened the balcony door an inch, and the air carried the iron breath of the bridge all the way into the kitchen. He didn't go near it. I shut it again, and the small climate of my home reasserted itself. Eucalyptus from the plant in the corner, lemon from last night's cleanser, tossed waiting for heat. I sat on the floor because chairs are too far away from certain truths. He came closer than he had the night before, which is the only metric that matters. We learned the door together. The first time I put the leash on, he accepted it as if it were medicine. Awful, necessary, not a betrayal so much as an old rumor repeating itself. I let it lie slack, a suggestion rather than a verdict. The hallway outside smelled of coats and rubber and a faint echo of someone else's dinner. He moved like the floor might not hold. On the stairs, he pressed to the wall and skittered when the metal edge cap flashed dull silver under the overhead light. I matched his pace and pretended we had important business at the speed of caution. Outside, the morning had gathered itself into a day. The river's voice dropped lower in daylight, less dramatic, more resigned. We did not go to the bridge. A bus sighed to a stop nearby and his body became an argument against existence. I knelt in the dirty patch where grass had decided it was done trying. Kneeling is a grammar dogs understand. He came close enough to smell my skin and decide it was still mine. A truck passed and the air bragged about it. He shook the memory off as if it were rain, and then was startled to find that worked. We made it as far as the corner where a woman with a red scarf and a bag of groceries shifted her weight and smiled without teeth, which is a kindness. "As beautiful," she said, which is a way of saying she saw him and not just the situation. He didn't know what to do with the word, so he let it pass like weather. Inside, the kettle taught us both the merits of repetition. It hissed and sang and gave up its heat, and in that ordinary music was a kind of liturgy. He began to anticipate the cup on the counter and the slice of boiled chicken cooling on a plate. He learned that the clink of ceramic against wood did not arrange violence. I learned where to touch him, the shoulder, the flank, never the neck, and where not to touch the day. Too much noise, too early, and the hours rebel. In the afternoons, he found a square of sun by the balcony door and laid in it so thoroughly the light seemed to be coming from him. Sometimes I would look up from the table and catch him watching me with an expression I cannot reproduce with human language, a mixture of duty and devotion, and the relief of having nothing expected of you except being there. We failed sometimes. When a pan slipped from my hand and hit the floor. He vanished into a shape so general it could have been a shadow. When a neighbor slammed the stairwell door, he rushed to the bathroom and wedged himself between the toilet and the wall, trying to become corner and tile. Each time I sat outside the bathroom and told the air about the day I had imagined having and the day we got instead. Eventually he would appear at the threshold and study the distance between us like an engineer measuring span and load. Then he would cross it, careful and noble, and place his paw near my knee as if to say we could begin again if I wanted to. I always wanted to. I knew we would have to go back to the bridge. Stories don't finish themselves. They ask to be escorted to their end. We waited for noon when the cold relented and the light was honest. The path down was snow, patched and pocked with old footprints, as if the ground had been keeping attendance. He smelled the place before he saw it and stopped so suddenly that the leash drew a quiet line from my wrist to his history. I didn't tug. I let the line mean what it meant and lowered myself to the earth, which smelled like iron, wet leaves, a hint of oil from a leaking truck overhead. The river kept up its work, tearing, never done. "We're just looking," I said, though who knows what he heard. He stood, shook once, and then forgot to shake again. The concrete pillar held our reflections without caring. He took a step and then used it to prove to himself that taking another was not a betrayal. We reached the exact place where fear once curled into sleep, and he lowered his head and breathed a long sentence I could not translate. Then he lifted it and turned away before the wind could change its mind. On the way back up, he brushed my leg and left a little of the river's smell on my jeans. I decided not to wash it out. A week later, the past arrived in a jacket that belonged to the Department of Claims and Complications, carrying a story that didn't fit in its mouth. A man had seen the flyer I had posted where good intentions go to be judged feudi, no kuyukius aski. He knocked and stood with a posture that suggested he had practiced being lamentable. "He's mine," the man said, placing the pronoun on the doormat like it weighed something. The shepherd, by then answering sometimes to Yori, a name that means trust in a language neither of us spoke, stood beside me and refused to decorate the moment with growls. He simply breathed. The man began to explain about a gate, about a cousin, about a day that got out of hand and refused to come back. His voice made commas where periods were required. I asked for papers and he gave me adjectives. I asked about the scar at Yori's neck, and he gave me calendar excuses. I wanted to be wrong about him. I wanted this to be the part of the film where the misunderstanding clears and everyone claps. But Yori chose for both of us. Chose by not moving toward the whistle the man made with his tongue. By not pretending to recognize the old pitch of command. By pressing his brow into my shin with the weight of someone notarizing a document. The man saw the signature. He lifted his hands, let them fall, and made exit noises. "Keep him then," he said finally, as if discarding a burden he had never borne. When the door closed, the kettle decided to sing. Some instruments know when to provide a soundtrack, even when no one asked. Adoption is the least cinematic of sacraments. We went to a room with chairs that made opinions about backs, and a woman wearing a cardigan the color of patience slid forms toward me. I have never written my name so carefully. Yori lay under the table and watched my foot like it might try to leave without him. When I clipped the new collar around his neck later, a soft brown leather that learned his shape without argument, I left a little space where the scar remembers. The leash felt different in my hand, less like a tether, more like what you hold when someone insists on carrying their own weight, but doesn't mind the company. Life didn't change so much as settle on a warmer side of itself. Yori learned the floor's geography, which boards creaked with opinions, which rug kept the sun. He discovered the laundry basket and the ethics of stealing a sock if you only do it to prove you still can. He stopped waking to check the door every hour. He began to snore the way proper beings do when they finally believe they won't be asked to defend their right to rest. On walks, he learned the map of the block the way children learn songs wrong at first, then glorious. The bridge became a landmark the way old sadness does, something you remember with your body, but do not have to visit unless you feel like showing off your bravery. Once, at the park, a child with a navy cap approached, and asked the sacred question in the right way. Can I pet your dog? I looked to Yori, who looked to me, which is how we ask for consent in our city of two. He approached the boy in a posture that meant yes, and placed his chin in the outstretched palm with the gravity of a vow. The boy said, "Wow," with his entire face. Somewhere behind me, a mother laughed and did not tell him to be careful, which is another kind of vow. Bad nights came, bad nights left. A siren sharpened the dark and Yori paced the hallway, counting the distance between one end and the other with his paws. I joined him, and we turned together like a lighthouse doing its arithmetic. The kettle did its soft math too, remembering the exact second before boil when hope feels inevitable but you still need to wait. We waited. He lay with his chest against my foot and claimed me as furniture. When the siren died, we let the silence inherit the room. On the anniversary of the bridge, I keep track. Some doors deserve flowers even if they were never yours to open. We returned. I brought no blanket. The wind had unlearned some of its old languages. Yori sniffed the pillar and did not shudder. He lifted his head to watch a train drag its astonishment over the river, and then shook water from ears that held none. We stood there together, not as penitents but as tourists of our own past, and I understood that courage is not the absence of shaking, but the decision to go ahead and let the shaking happen in the direction of home. Most days are unremarkable in the way life is when it's finally allowed to be life. I work. He naps. Sunlight tries different outfits on the floor. The smell of coffee hums around ordinary conversations with friends who have learned to pause so they can greet him first. In the evenings, he brings me the leash not because he must, but because he likes the shape we make on sidewalks. He knows which shopkeeper keeps treats and which person needs him to lean casually against their shin to fix a day that went the wrong color. I have become a man who does not hurry stairs. This morning, he pressed his brow to my leg again, the ceremonial gesture that started everything, and in the soft weight of it, I felt the entire map, the bridge, the wind with too many keys, the concrete that forgave nothing, the bowl on the kitchen floor, the bathwater making rain where there was none, the scars learning to exist beside leather that would never tighten. I poured tea. The kettle exhaled its triumph. Outside, the river continued to tear its cloth, the way all rivers do, not out of malice but out of insistence. Inside, we stitched our day together with small, invisible threads, a look, a breath, a door opening with no agenda, the quiet that follows trust when it's done showing off. If you ask me why this story matters, I would hand you his leash and tell you to feel what it feels like when a creature chooses the length of it and still walks beside you. I would tell you about the sound of a single bite taken by a starving dog in the dark, and how that sound can rearrange the furniture of your chest. I would tell you that the bridge is still there and the water keeps doing what water does, and that none of that contradicts the fact that, in a kitchen the color of bread, a dog is sleeping because he can. I would tell you that rescue is not a noun but a verb in the present continuous, and that every morning, when he opens his eyes and recognizes the room, I get to say the quietest, proudest sentence, I know we made it here. Sometimes late, I hear the city loosen its grip, and the wind tries the doorknob like a polite thief. Yori lifts his head, checks nothing in particular, and puts it down again. The door stays where it is, not as a barrier, but as a promise that the room will still be our room when the sun interprets it next. The bridge belongs to its engineers and its traffic and the pigeons who believe it was erected as a roost. The river belongs to gravity. This warm square of rug belongs to a dog who learned that fear can be persuaded to sleep, and to a man who learned that gentleness, repeated often enough, becomes a structure you can live inside. The story ends the way mornings begin, with light considering the floor, deciding to stay, and a brow pressed to a shin like a seal on a document both of us keep signing. The first real spring rain came softly, as if the sky remembered the bridge and was trying not to wake its ghosts. The air smelled of metal and grass, and the river, swollen and loud, carried fragments of branches and a piece of blue plastic that caught the light like a stubborn memory. Yori stood at the balcony door, watching it fall, his fur darker in the wet light. He had grown heavier, steadier, the bones that once spoke of hunger now hid politely under strength. He looked back at me with that quiet intelligence dogs borrow from eternity. The look that says, "You've done enough, you can rest now." I poured tea and let the kettle hiss like an old friend clearing its throat. We had come far enough that silence was fluent between us. I no longer felt the need to speak every gratitude aloud. He no longer felt the need to flinch when I reached for the leash. Healing, I had learned, doesn't arrive like an ending. It drifts in like mist, unannounced, until one morning you realize the air is easier to breathe. We went out when the rain eased. The bridge waited, older and gentler in daylight. Moss clung to the concrete seams like forgiveness trying to stay put. Cars crossed above, anonymous and hurried, unaware that beneath them 2 creatures were writing the last line of a story they hadn't meant to begin. Yori trotted beside me, leash slack, tail low but not afraid, just measured like someone who knows the value of peace. He stopped halfway down the slope, the same place where months earlier he had refused to move. His body remembered, but his eyes argued otherwise. He looked toward the dark hollow under the span, the den that had once been his only vocabulary for safety, and I felt the past breathe through both of us. A single exhale shared by 2 survivors of the same night. Then he did something that bent the world a little. He walked toward it, not with fear, not with defiance, but with curiosity, as if visiting a story that no longer belonged to him. I followed in silence. The ground was damp, layered with last year's leaves turned to paper. The air under the bridge was cooler, still haunted by the metallic scent of the river. Yori sniffed the concrete pillar, circled once, and sat. The spot where I'd first found him was nothing special now, just shadow and mud, a forgotten corner of the city's underbelly. But in that plainness lay a strange grace, proof that even the ugliest places can host miracles without realizing it. I knelt beside him and touched the back of his neck, where the scar had faded to a pale thread. "You did it," I whispered. He turned his head and pressed it against my chest, the same way he had pressed his brow to my shin on the night he chose to stay. The gesture was heavier now, not desperate, just complete. Water dripped rhythmically from the bridge, each drop a small applause. Above us, a train passed, shaking loose a rain of dust that turned briefly golden in a shaft of light. It felt like blessing disguised as accident. We stayed there longer than I meant to, letting the minutes spread themselves thin. Time has different manners under bridges. It doesn't hurry you out. When we finally rose, Yori shook the river's smell from his coat and led me back toward the daylight. His stride was confident, almost proud. I realized I had stopped thinking of him as fragile. He was simply Yori now, whole in the way that wholeness stops needing proof. At home, he went straight to the rug by the door, circled twice, and dropped with the satisfied grunt of someone clocking out of duty. I dried his fur with a towel, and he tolerated it with mock annoyance, leaning into my hands like a friend pretending to protest affection. Outside, the rain thickened again, blurring the city's edges into watercolor. Inside, the kettle began its familiar song. I poured 2 cups out of habit, one for me, one cooling near his bowl, because some rituals are more about memory than logic. As the steam curled upward, I thought about that night months ago. The sound that lured me under the bridge, the eyes that met mine, the way the world had tilted just enough to let 2 lost beings stumble into each other's orbit. I had gone there hollowed out by my own quiet loneliness, the kind that modern life disguises as business. Maybe that's why I heard him when others didn't. Maybe we saved each other from the same cold. The window fogged with warmth. Yori lifted his head, blinked, then rested it back down, sighing in that slow, heavy way that forgives everything. His tail twitched once before sleep claimed it. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. For a while I just listened. To his breathing. To the city rinsing itself clean. To the faint hum of life happening exactly as it should. Sometimes I wonder how many other bridges hold stories like ours. How many small, trembling creatures wait for the sound of footsteps that won't harm them. You can't save them all, people say, and they're right. But you can save one, and for that one, it's the same as saving the world. Yori taught me that redemption isn't a single act, it's the daily choice to stay kind when no one's watching. Every morning when he presses his brow to my leg, sealing our unspoken contract again, I remember what the river said that night: keep moving, keep mending, keep warm. Months have passed since then. The scar on his neck has vanished under new fur. He runs now, the kind of run that doesn't measure distance but freedom. Children at the park know his name. Strangers smile when they see us. He still glances at the horizon sometimes, as if checking that the bridge remains where he left it, but he doesn't linger on the thought. Neither do I. We've learned that the past doesn't need erasing. It only needs enough love to outgrow its shadow. This evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the buildings the color of old honey, I found Yori watching the window again. His reflection sat beside mine on the glass. Two figures blurred into one. Outside, the city kept its promises. Lights flickered on, buses sighed. Life went on being complicated and beautiful. I reached down and scratched behind his ear, right where the fur thickened. He leaned closer, eyes half closed, and for a moment I could feel his heart ticking through my wrist. Steady, ordinary, perfect. We are both different now. I am softer in ways that don't show on the skin. He is braver in ways that don't require proof. The world, indifferent as ever, still hums and rumbles above its bridges, but in one small kitchen a man and his dog exist in a quiet treaty with the universe. The rain has stopped. The air smells of tea and trust. I turn off the kettle and let the last warmth drift through the room. When the light fades completely, Yori lifts his head and pads over, pressing his brow against my shin. That simple, sacred act that began it all. I rest my hand on his back, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing. The night outside belongs to the city. This small warmth belongs to us. For the first time in a long time, I believe the world is, if not kind, at least capable of kindness. The bridge is still out there, unbothered and eternal, but tonight it sleeps without witnesses. And under this roof, where trust finally found a place to live, a dog once abandoned dreams of nothing more than tomorrow. And that, I've learned, is the purest form of peace.